Chapter 4. Entropic bodies. The prospect of what Wells called downward modification would haunt the European imagination in the last decades of the 19th century. Every direction one turned, scientists pointed toward the possibility, even inevitability, of changes within the physical or social environment that would irrevocably reshape the human form and human culture. As 19th century physics, evolutionism, and social medicine generated the highly compatible models of entropy, species reversion, and human pathology, it became clear that such alterations would be disastrous ones, transforming the human species into something unrecognizable, perhaps even ensuring its extinction. The conflation of these models is best exemplified in degeneration theory, discussed below, prominent throughout Europe at the fin de siècle. Degenerationism is a highly narrative discourse, concerned, as Daniel Pick writes, with the dynamic patterns which underpin the chain of changing pathologies across generations. One like that of entropy to degenerationism is a minus narrative, reversing the direction of ameliorist versions of evolutionism, which proposed natural history as an inevitable progression towards higher and more complex forms, and human history as an inevitable progression towards a higher and more rarefied state of civilization. The telos of the narrative in the first case was the human form, in the second, European culture. Degeneration theory, however, not only reversed the narrative of progress, proposing a negative telos of abhumanness and cultural disarray. It also accelerated the pace of the narrative, emphasizing the mutability and flux of human bodies and societies. Degenerationism, in other words, is a Gothic discourse, and as such is a crucial imaginative and narrative source for the fin de siècle Gothic. 4.1 Degenerate subspecies carrot. When under any kind of noxious influences an organism becomes debilitated, its successors will not resemble the healthy, normal type of the species, with capacities for development, but will form a new subspecies, which, like all others, possesses the capacity of transmitting to its offspring, in a continuously increasing degree, its peculiarities, these being morbid deviations from the normal form, gaps in development, malformations, and infirmities. B.A. Morel, Trait de Degenerescences. In 1857 Benedictine Augustin Morel published his Trait de Degenerescences. Physiques, Intellectuels et Moralis de Bespes Humain carrot treatise on the degeneration of the human species. Though the idea of human biological degeneration was not original to Morel, he was the first to articulate it into a full-blown theory of heredity, and the trait set the terms of the discussion of degeneration for the rest of the century. Morel posited a gloomy sequence of causes and effects, a hereditary line that began with the first set of defective parents and ended in madness and extinction. The first generation, infected by such modern poisons as urban pollutants and addictive stimulants, passed its infection through the seed, to a second generation prone to epilepsy, neurasthenia, and hysteria, a third generation hovering near the brink of insanity, and a fourth and final generation doomed to congenital idiocy and sterility. 5. Degeneration was evolution reversed and compressed. Like evolution theory, degenerationism concerned itself with the long-term effects of heredity within the lifespan of a species, and with biological variations from type that affected not just the individual, but the generations to follow. But for the idea of evolution towards ever higher forms of life, degenerationism substituted a terrible regression, a downward spiral into madness, chaos, and extinction. Heredity was not the vehicle of progress, it was an invisible source of contamination, with the infection jumping across bodies, across the generations, and manifesting itself in visible physical deformity. While the evolution from animal to human, from savage to modern, had taken place gradually, over an unthinkable span of time, degeneration was rapid and fatal. A family line could suffer extinction in 4 generations, hardly more than a human lifetime, and a culture, too, could sicken and die almost as quickly. Gothic heredity. In pathological terms, degeneration is a morbid change in the structure of parts of the organism, consisting in a disintegration of tissue, or in a substitution of a lower for a higher form of tissue, OED. The individual organism, in other words, wastes away as the result of some disease, substance abuse, or congenital abnormality that causes irreversible deterioration of the tissue. Morel's theory focused particularly on lesions of the brain, which he argued were both degenerative and transmissible to offspring. A lesion might be caused by certain poisons characteristic of modern society: narcotics and stimulants, alcohol, tobacco, opium, hashish, arsenic, industrial wastes, and tainted foods, as well as by poor diet, hazardous occupations, such illnesses as marsh fever, syphilis, tuberculosis, and goitre, and even an accidental blow to the head. However the parent acquired the degenerative lesion, the offspring could not fail to inherit it. According to the Lamarckian evolutionism that informed degeneration theory, characteristics acquired during the lifetime of the parent could be passed on to the next generation. 6 And what was worse, the degenerate offspring inherited the parent's acquired morbidity in some aggravated form. Jules Bernard Lewis wrote in Maladies Mentales that the individual who comes into the world is not an isolated being separated from his kindred. He is bound to those who preceded him and to those who follow him, and to the atomic influences which he possesses, he serves for their temporary resting place, and he transmits them to his descendants. 7 Degeneration was an falling version of this continuity within the species, the Gothic nightmare of heredity. In the first place, degeneracy was easily transmitted. The child could inherit a morbid taint from either parent, thanks to the law of double fertilization, Carlson, p. 122, and the smallest possible lapse on the part of the parents was enough to doom the offspring. Cesare Lombroso, in The Man of Genius, 1864, English trans 1891, warned that even habitually sober parents, who at the moment of conception are in a temporary state of drunkenness, beget children who are epileptic or paralytic, idiotic or insane. Thus a single embrace, given in a moment of drunkenness, may be fatal to an entire generation, p. 144. In the second place, degeneracy was self-perpetuating, once the chain of reproduction had been set in motion. Virtually all of the subjects of Richard von Krafft-Ebing's 237 case studies in Psychopathia Sexualis, written and revised 1882 to 1902, are contaminated by what he calls hereditary taint, a family history of neurasthenia, or hysteria, or alcoholism, or insanity, or all 4. Case 126, describing a sexual invert, homosexual, is typical, Lima S., age 29, single, merchant's daughter, of a family having bad nervous taint. Father was a drinker and died by suicide, as also did the patient's brother and sister. A sister suffered with convulsive hysteria. Mother's father shot himself while insane. Mother was sickly, and paralyzed after apoplexy. At 14, the patient suffered chlorosis and catalepsy from fright. Later, Marked hysteria and an attack of hysterical insanity. P317, another invert, similarly tainted by a family history of nervous and mental illnesses, sent an autobiography to Kraft Heaping in which he described how the taint had been passed on to his own children. My wife gave birth to our first boy in a difficult labor, a boy still afflicted with a melancholy nature. Then came a second, who was very quiet, a third, full of peculiarities, a fourth, a fifth, and all have the predisposition to neurasthenia. P333. And finally, degeneracy was progressive in its effects, as the original contamination, be it ever so slight, intensified itself in the offspring, and was manifested in the increasing mental and physical deformity of each successive generation. Morel was a monogynist, that is, he believed that the various human races had degenerated, in greater and lesser degrees, from the ethnic perfection of the first couple, rather than evolving as separate species in different regions of the world. And the idea of the fall from grace heavily influenced the trait and the writings of even the polygynist authors on degeneracy who followed Morel. Degeneration, like syphilis, with which it was often confused, could be seen as a divine punishment for some original sin. Degenerationists wrote in highly colored, apocalyptic style of the sins of the parents being visited most heavily on the heads of children who had forfeited their innocence even before birth. Point 10. The perverted morality of one generation of the alcoholic mother, the father who had contracted syphilis from prostitutes, found literalization in the deformed bodies and minds of the next. Syphilitic children were born shrunken and wizened like little old men and women, and degenerate children were born with a disposition to vice as great as the most depraved adults. Cultural contagion. Morel proposed a basically limited model of degeneration, writing that fortunately, the morbid deviation is soon rendered sterile, and after a few generations often dies out before it reaches the lowest grade of organic degradation. 11. But during the last decades of the 19th century, this model of degeneration yielded to one that was ever more contagious, ever more progressive in its effects, that could spread wildly through the ranks of society and destroy an entire culture. Within the larger etiology of degeneration constructed after Morel, the social organism was as vulnerable as the individual organism to degenerative disease, to morbid infection, deterioration, and death. In a vicious circle of causes and effects, a poisonous society, locus of both environmental and moral contaminants, infected the individual passed the infection to its offspring, and the degenerate offspring reinfected society. Point 12. The issue of environment's causal relation to degeneracy did not entirely disappear from this larger social etiology. Garrett Stedman Jones' Outcast London describes the whole body of work that sprang up around the problem of hereditary urban degeneration, particularly as it affected that problematic subspecies, the inner city, working class, Londoner. Point 13. According to James Cantwell's Degeneration Amongst Londoners, 1885, the original cause of urban degeneration was the lack of ozone in the London air, and subsequent generations born to city-bred parents starved of sunlight and fresh air were launched upon a downward spiral of degradation that matched Morel's worst nightmares. Point 1. P. Freeman Williams, The Effect of Town Life on the General Health, 1890, wrote that the second generation Londoner was excitable and painfully precocious in childhood, neurotic, dyspeptic, pale and undersized in its adult state, if it ever reaches it. This town type became more and more exaggerated in the third and fourth generations, that is, if the type managed to survive that long. TT has been maintained with considerable show of probability that a pure Londoner of the fourth generation like Morel's fifth generation degenerate is not capable of existing. 1. Cantwell located a third generation Londoner only after considerable difficulties, and he was but a sorry specimen. Height 5 feet 3 inches. Age 19. Chest measurement 20 inches. His head measured 20 inches round, 2 inches below the average. His face is mottled, pale, and pimpled. He squints rather badly. His jaws are misshapen, and his teeth spiculated. P22.16. J. Milner Fothergill, the town dweller, 1889, warned that urban degeneration was forming a new subspecies of Cockney mannikins, a race of dwarfs, as successive generations of Eastenders devolved further and further back to the lowlier and more primitive racial types, Urs, Celto-Iberians, Pre-Aryans, from which their rustic ancestors had sprung. Pages 107,113 to 14. But the larger issue at stake here was not so much the physical well-being of the working classes as the overall health of the nation. As Fothergill stated rather baldly, the deterioration, both physical and mental, of the town-bred organisms, is a matter not meant for the philanthropist, but for the social economist. P. 114. In late Victorian England, the theory of urban degeneration was used to explain away the nation's economic decline after the boom of mid-century. Britain was faltering because it was forced to draw both its labor force and its recruits for the Imperial Army 17 from a class of degenerates. The new subspecies of degenerate proletariat found in the inner city was born with a stunted and weakened physique, and thus was constitutionally incapable of hard work, and born with a stunted and weakened moral character, and thus constitutionally prone to such evils as idleness, criminality, alcoholism, and political agitation. The degeneracy of the inner city working classes might be temporarily checked by the migration of healthy rural laborers, but these newcomers, too, would become infected by the miasmic London air and miasmic London morals, and breed more defective offspring. As Stedman Jones writes, if the theory of urban degeneration was correct, then the long-run consequences of the migration into the towns would be a progressive deterioration of the race, p. 286, and a progressive deterioration of the British economy whose industries relied so heavily on urban labor pools. Similarly, any decline in national military power, France's defeat at the hands of the Prussians, Britain's losses during the first half of the war could be accounted for by the theory of degeneration. Degeneration was linked to the rise of democracy, class mobility, and racial miscegenation 18 and thus could explain the social instability that seemed to be sweeping across fin de siècle Europe and post-bellum America. Degeneration, which caused the population to drift into unwise extremes of eating and drinking, religion, or revelry, lavishness or effeminacy, Cantwell, p. 21, could also be seen as the source of all social problems, alcoholism, prostitution, unemployment, crime, a low national birth rate, divorce, suicide, deviant sexual practices. All these were blamed on the deteriorating bodies, deteriorating minds, and deteriorating moral character of the people. 19 Kraft Heaping wrote that the fall of great nations in the past had always been connected with widespread degeneracy and moral decay. The material and moral ruin of the community is readily brought about by debauchery, adultery, and luxury, which can always be traced to psychopathological or neuropathological conditions of the nations involved, pages 34 to 5. Morel had opened the door to this type of analysis, in which immorality was both causal and symptomatic, with his emphasis on alcoholism as a primary cause of degeneration. Both the weak-willed alcoholic parents and their miserable descendants, born with a predisposition to alcoholism and too weak to resist addiction, were characterized not only by dementia, but also by stupidity, the absence of all intellectual initiative, and the abolition of the moral sentiments. They have sacrificed to their frenzied desires all which they ought to have held most dear. p. 109. Though the alcoholic might be poisoned by liquor or heredity, alcoholism was also an immoral behavior that went hand in hand with other immoral behaviors, riotousness, domestic irresponsibility, idleness, and sexual excess, not to mention theft, violence, prostitution, and labor agitation. Sexual contagion. In other words, while degeneration was technically a medical term, and denoted a particular subcategory of organic disease, this disease wrought moral effects by inducing in the human organism a morbid deviation from an original type whose offspring were congenitally prone, or so the theory went, to sinful behaviors. Symptoms became increasingly confused with causes as degeneration theory became a tool for measuring the moral health of society as well as the health of the individual. 28 Predisposition to vice could be either inherited or acquired during an individual's lifetime. In either case, the contamination could be passed on through either heredity or simple association, through sexual intercourse or social intercourse. Degeneration came to stand in for a sort of general turpitude with which modern society was infecting itself, and against which modern society had to police itself. Sexual turpitude in particular became synonymous with degeneration in the later decades of the 19th century. Deviant sexuality could be classed as degenerate in four senses: its recapitulation of the less evolved sexuality of so-called primitives, its hereditability, its deteriorative effect on mind and body, and its general corrupting influence on public morals. In works like Edward Reich's History, Natural Laws, Laws of Hygiene and Maturity, 1864, Edward Westermarck's History of Human Marriage, 1891, and Kraft Hebing's Fragments of a System of Psychology of Sexual Life, the introductory chapter to Psychopathia Sexualis, deviant sexuality was synonymous with socio-cultural devolution. According to these texts, cultural evolution could be defined as a progression from the promiscuous or perverse sexuality characteristic of primitive societies to the institutionalization of monogamy, and the elevation of modesty, chastity, and sexual fidelity, characteristic in modern Christian nations. Kraft Hebing, p. 31.21. Deviant sexual behaviors, masturbation, homosexuality, any sexual activity, in fact, besides normal intercourse within Christian matrimony. 22, constituted a sort of behavioral recapitulation of some ancestral state, and a betrayal of the socio-evolutionary process that distinguished the modern Caucasian from the present-day non-European primitive. Though the sexual deviant did not actually devolve before one's eyes, he or she did deteriorate physically. Masturbation, for example, was said to debilitate the sexual organs and nervous system. Various of Kraft Hebing's masturbating patients complain of weakened potency from loss of sperm, premature ejaculation, general neurasthenia, even spinal irritation. Pages 321, 287, 383. Masturbation also weakened the moral fiber and ruined the health of the libido. Nothing is so prone to contaminate, under certain circumstances, even to exhaust, the source of all noble and ideal sentiments, as the practice of masturbation in early years. It despoils the unfolding bud of perfume and beauty, and leaves behind only the coarse, animal desire for sexual satisfaction. If an individual thus depraved reaches the age of maturity, there is wanting in him that aesthetic, ideal, pure, and free impulse which draws the opposite sexes together. The glow of sensual sensibility wanes, and the inclination toward the opposite sex is weakened. Mature and perverse sexual satisfaction injures not merely the mind, but also the body, inasmuch as it induces neuroses of the sexual apparatus, irritable weakness of the centers governing erection and ejaculation, defective pleasurable feeling in coitus, etc., while, at the same time, it maintains imagination and libido in continuous excitement. Pages 310 to 11. While Kraft Hebing considered masturbation a bad habit rather than a congenital perversion, even though he did marvel at how many of his youthful deviants picked up the habit without any teaching, masturbation was the means by which other vices became rooted in the vita sexualis. At the age of 13 he developed a weakness for ladies' boots with high heels. He pressed them between his thighs and thus produced ejaculation. He soon added to this fancy the idea that he lay at the feet of a pretty girl and allowed her to kick him with her pretty boots. Pages 199 to 200. He began to masturbate excessively. When he did this, he would imagine that he carried out the sexual act with a roomful of women and then killed them. p. 130. Since that time the picture of old men performing the sexual act enlivened his dreams with pollution, and was present in his mind during masturbation. p. 391. Masturbation exacerbated fetishism, sadism, masochism, necrophilia, and homosexuality, and if these vices were not discouraged, they would inevitably cause sexual pathology in the offspring. Even the mildest case of abnormality could be hereditarily transferred, in such a manner that it becomes transformed into a perversion in the next generation. p. 234. Aberrant sexuality, then, could be inherited, and was symptomatic of degeneration, but aberrant sexual practices could also be learned, and thus become a fresh cause of hereditary degeneration in a hitherto untainted family. When this happened, then even normal sexuality for the purpose of procreation became the means by which corruption was transmitted. Kraft Hebing made some effort to distinguish between disease, congenital abnormal sexual behavior, and vice, acquired bad sexual habits, which he also differentiated as perversion and perversity. The congenital invert, for example, was born with a neuropathic predisposition to homosexuality, p. 308, while the sometime homosexual had been corrupted by depraved companions, or weakened his mental health through excessive masturbation. But even acquired perversities, if they continued to be indulged, would rapidly debilitate the mind and body, so that even an individual with an untainted lineage could soon be in as lamentable a condition as the born sexual deviant. And either type was contagious, both would transmit their pathology to their offspring, and both were capable of seducing and corrupting normal, sexually healthy individuals. The implosion of modernity. The city still played a primary role in initiating the chain of degeneracy, but this was not the city as site of environmental hazard so much as the city as a modern Sodom and Gomorrah, the breeding ground of perverse and unnatural sexuality. Gilman, Sexology, p. 214. Though degeneration caused the culture to slide back into more primitive behaviors, and even caused the individual, in the case of the invert, to revert back to a primitive bisexuality such as still exists in the lowest classes of animal life and also during the first months of fetal existence in man. 23, degeneration was, unfortunately, the particular plague of modernity, of those European nations that prided themselves on their high state of evolution. Kraft-Keeping wrote that anomalies of the sexual functions are met with especially in civilized races, and that degenerates could be found especially in the centers of culture and refinement. pp. 7799. The reason for all of this, according to Max Nordau's Degeneration, 1893, English trans 1895, was that an increasingly evolved society was an increasingly debilitated society. Modern European peoples were being enervated by the frenetic pace of modern civilization. Civilized nations, Nordau believed, had grown inordinately exhausted in the last 50 years. Fatigue changes healthy men into hysterical, and the whole of civilized humanity has been exposed to fatigue for half a century. p. 39. Degeneration's analysis of this new carrot phenomenon, physical exhaustion, was greatly influenced by George Beard's American Nervousness, Its Causes and Consequences, 1881. Beard described a new disease he called neurasthenia, lack of nerve force, whose symptoms, like the symptoms of degeneration, were legion, and whose cause could be found, quite simply, in modernity. Point 24. The chief and primary cause of this development and very rapid increase of nervousness is modern civilization, which is distinguished from the ancient by these 5 characteristics: steam power, the periodical press, the telegraph, the sciences, and the mental activity of women. p. 6. Emphasis in text. Nordau, however, defined neurasthenia as a secondary manifestation of a much greater problem, modern hysteria. The first generation subjected to such new and stressful phenomena as crowded urban living, railway travel, and daily newspapers had grown hysterical, and the next generation had inherited that hysteria. All these activities, even the simplest, involve an effort of the nervous system and a wearing of tissue. Every line we read or write, every human face we see, every conversation we carry on, every scene we perceive through the window of the flying express, sets in activity our sensory nerves and our brain centers. Our stomachs cannot keep pace with the brain and nervous system. And so there follows what always happens if great expenses are met by small incomes. First the savings are consumed, then comes bankruptcy. Pages 39 to 40. Nordau made a distinction between this fatigue hysteria and organic degeneration caused by a brain lesion or heredity. However, each disease was heritable, each caused further susceptibility to the other, and both fed into the greater problem of national or cultural degeneration. The first exhausted generation had turned to stimulants, alcohol and tobacco, for relief, and this began a disastrous, vicious circle of reciprocal effects. The drinker, and apparently the smoker also, begets enfeebled children, hereditarily fatigued or degenerated, and these drink and smoke in their turn, because they are fatigued. p. 41. And like the addiction to alcohol and tobacco, the addiction to thrills was hereditary, self-perpetuating, and progressive. The modern man and woman inherited the enfeebled constitution of parents enervated by too much and too rapid change, and that enfeebled constitution left the modern man and woman hungry for more change, for any innovation, however depraved, that might cause the exhausted nerve synapses to fire again. The exhausted, hysterical state of the modern public accounted, in Nordau's view, for the widespread social immorality earlier degenerationists had described. But more importantly, it accounted for the growing immorality, the sickness and degeneration, of modern culture. The primary target of degeneration is such aesthetic movements as Impressionism, Naturalism, Mysticism, and Symbolism, effete movements which emphasized form over substance, and which Nordau believed to be unhealthy and dangerous. According to him, these movements were the morbid invention of degenerates, masturbators, lunatics, homosexuals, and alcoholics, who knew well how to shock and titillate a jaded public looking for a thrill. They glorified obscenity, filth, and social chaos. They rewrote the end-of-century constitutional exhaustion sweeping across Europe into a sort of romantic decadence, encouraging the public to sink back in a pleasant, dreamy languor rather than fighting against its weakness. And their degeneration was infectious, given the nervous susceptibility of the exhausted public. In Nordau's typical scenario, a Wagner or a Verlaine announces the formation of some new school, the invention of his diseased brain. Other degenerate, hysterical, neurasthenical minds flock around him to imitate and promote his work, and the hysterical, impressionable public goes wild with admiration. P.P.S. Nordau dedicated degeneration to his dear and honored master Lombroso, whose The Man of Genius posited that genius was the result of a brain lesion, nothing more than another form of degeneration. Lombroso's book is largely an itemization of geniuses throughout the ages who suffered from all the symptoms of degeneration: alcoholism, insanity, egoism, epilepsy, monomania, delusions, melancholy, and a whole host of nervous disorders. Lombroso argued that genius, like degeneration, was a function of tainted heredity, found in the children of inebriate, imbecile, idiotic, or epileptic parents. p. 359. And though genius was a one-time biological phenomenon that could not be transferred to the offspring, it, like degeneration, also resulted in the rapid deterioration and extinction of the hereditary line. When transmitted, genius almost always assumes the form of more and more aggravated neurosis, and rapidly disappears, thanks to that beneficent sterility, through which nature provides for the elimination of monsters. The fact would be quite sufficiently demonstrated by the pedigrees of Peter the Great, the Caesars, and Charles V, in which epileptics, men of genius, and criminals alternate with ever greater frequency, till the line ends in idiocy and sterility. p. 333. Despite all this, Lombroso's opinion of the man of genius was fairly benign. He believed that the genius contributed, at the expense of his own health and sanity, to the advancement of science, philosophy, and culture. In other words, a morbid biological aberration, the degeneratist genius, was paradoxically the most valuable tool of social evolution. Nordau, however, broke with his master on this issue. I do not share Lombroso's opinion that highly gifted degenerates are an active force in the progress of mankind. They corrupt and delude, they do, alas, frequently exercise a deep influence, but this is always a painful one. p. 24. Nordau believed that degenerate aesthetic practices were more widespread, and more dangerous, than Lombroso had realized. Their numbers included symbolism, decadence, and aestheticism, pre-Raphaelitism, Ibsenism, Tolstoyism, and the schools of Wagner, Nietzsche, and Zola. These various degenerate schools he classed as examples of either mysticism, egomania, or false realism, 3 types of aesthetic perception and expression which resulted from an exhausted central nervous system and degenerative malfunction of the brain. In all 3 tendencies we detect the same ultimate elements, viz., a brain incapable of normal working, thence feebleness of will, inattention, predominance of emotion, lack of knowledge, absence of sympathy or interest in the world and humanity, atrophy of the notion of duty and morality. p. 536. Degeneration was the book of the 1890s, phenomenally popular throughout Europe. 26 It was perhaps the most successful example of that late Victorian subgenre, the socio-medical text, incorporating biology, evolutionism, psychopathology, moral philosophy, and socio-cultural analysis into one sweeping critique of modernity. Nonetheless, Degeneration is a cranky book, reading like a 600-page Orwellian satire of modern culture. It is a bitter Philippic against every aesthetic movement that, in Nordau's opinion, showed contempt for traditional views of custom and morality. p5. To Nordau, any break from traditional forms could never denote progress, only mental and cultural devolution. Modern artists might claim to speak to the future, but in reality they spoke from a forgotten, faraway past, a human evolutionary past of inarticulateness, childishness, and savagery. Degenerates lisp and stammer, instead of speaking. They utter monosyllabic cries, instead of constructing grammatically and syntactically articulated sentences. They draw and paint like children, who dirty tables and walls with mischievous hands. They confound all the arts, and lead them back to the primitive forms they had before evolution differentiated them. Every one of their qualities is atavistic, p555, and Degeneration is a gloomy, apocalyptic book, playing to all the fears and uncertainties Gentisiacal Europe entertained during what Nordau called the twilight of the nations. Modern Europe had considered itself the supreme product of socio-cultural evolution, but now it worried that the process of evolution had peaked, and that Western civilization, contaminated by the very fruits of its own progress, was sliding into a fatal decline, into senility, dementia, and death. We stand now in the midst of a severe mental epidemic, of a sort of black death of degeneration and hysteria, and it is natural that we should ask anxiously on all sides, what is to come next? Nordau, p537. Recuperating humanists. Judging from the past, we may safely infer that not one living species will transmit its unaltered likeness to a distant futurity. And of the species now living, very few will transmit progeny of any kind to a far distant futurity, for the manner in which all organic beings are grouped, shows that the greater number of species in each genus, and all the species in many genera, have left no descendants, but have become utterly extinct. Darwin, The Origin of Species, p373. In Degeneration theory, the prospect of the loss of human specificity is entertained to an almost overwhelming degree. The human body, the human species, human cultures, all are balanced in such tenuous equilibrium that the slightest disturbance will send the whole human enterprise crashing down. Perhaps nothing will be left in the ruins. Within the disparate but interlocking etiologies proposed by degenerationism, even the as yet healthy body is dangerously permeable and fragile. Contamination passes swiftly between the individual bodies enmeshed within a densely packed cultural space, and travels fatally across the generations. One drink at the wrong time, one generation without sunlight, one blow to the head, one masturbatory fantasy, and the whole hereditary line is doomed. Or perhaps what emerges from the ruins will be an abomination. Degenerationists emphasize the ominous mutability of the human body, its liability to have human becomings. Even now, they believe, such transformations are upon us, producing what Morel described as a new subspecies, Cantlai as a race of dwarfs, and Lamrasso as a strange breed of monsters. Despite its obsessive rewriting of a narrative of human entropy, however, degenerationism did offer two main strategies for reconstituting a fully human identity. The first was to affirm one's own, through a return to such values as perseverance, hard work, and clean thinking. If the European population struggled hard to resist the effects of degeneration, they would, at least according to the laws of Lamarckian evolution, pass on to the next generation not idleness and dissipation, but firmness, self-denial, and moral strength, and human civilization would be put back on the track. Krafft Ebing promised that willpower and a strong character could cure all but the most depraved or congenitally defective. He urged his patients to abjure such filthy practices as masturbation, homosexual activities, and sadomasochism, and exorcisy their imagination in the right direction, towards normal heterosexual intercourse, pages 34, 377.27. Nordau predicted that the European nations would, within a few generations, adapt to modernity, and produce a new and vitalized species equipped to cope with the rapid pace of modern life. To do this, however, the present generations would have to practice the expansion of consciousness and the contraction of the unconscious, the strengthening of will and weakening of impulsions, the increase of self-responsibility and the repression of reckless egoism, p554. The second strategy was to fully acknowledge the possibility of humanness, but to acknowledge it only as the possibility of others, the masturbator, the East End denizen, the homosexual, the decadent aesthete, against whom the normative subject emerged as unquestionably human. Each healthy individual must resolve to do strong and resolute combat with the evil. Nordau, p552. Nordau believed that degenerates were ultimately doomed to extinction because they would be weeded out by the process of natural selection. The feeble, the degenerate will perish. They must be abandoned to their inexorable fate. They are past cure or amelioration. However, one could not just sit back and wait for this to happen. The misguided masses, who were only victims to fashion and certain cunning impostures, would be led further astray, and the recovery of civilized humanity proceed much more slowly, if degenerates were not actively suppressed. Pages 550-1. He proposed a league of doctors, professors, authors, politicians, and judges, a society for ethical culture which would take it upon itself to educate the public and expose the degenerate. It is the sacred duty of all healthy and moral men to take part in the work of protecting and saving those who are not already too deeply diseased. Only by each individual doing its duty will it be possible to dam up the invading mental malady. He must mercilessly crush under his thumb the antisocial vermin. Such is the treatment of the disease of the age which I hold to be efficacious. Characterization of the leading degenerates as mentally diseased, unmasking, and stigmatizing of their imitators as enemies to society, cautioning the public against the lies of these parasites, pages 566-7, 560. Suppression of the degenerate was demanded as a biological imperative, a social imperative, and a national imperative. As an unchecked source of contamination, the degenerate could destroy a family, a race, a nation, or even Western civilization itself. However, the degenerate could also be the source of further socio-evolutionary progress if society grew its ranks and mustered its strength to expel the source of contamination, to crush the antisocial vermin, in Nordau's evocative phrase. As Sander Gilman has argued, degeneration stands in as the negative term in a positive dialectical model of moral and cultural evolution progressing by action and reaction. Degeneracy, within this model, could be described as ultimately a positive force as it moves humanity to the necessary changes in forms of human interaction. Society thus benefits from its own repression as it dialectically causes changes within itself. Sexology, p198. To put it another way, by dehumanizing, abhumanizing, the degenerate, the normative subject humanized itself. 4.2 Objecting whiteness, H.G. Wells. The Time Machine. Between the most wretched individual of the Hottentot race and the most accomplished European, viewed as the perfection of his time, there is less dissemblance than between the same European and the sickly degenerated being designated by the name of Cretan. Between the intellectual state of the wildest Bosjesman and that of the most civilized European, there is less difference than between the intellectual state of the same European and that of the degenerate being in whom arrest of intellect is due to cerebral atrophy, congenital or acquired. Morale, Treatise, pages 219, 221. Despite such recuperative strategies, one result of degeneration theory was to theorize abhumanness, at least the degenerate variety of it, as a uniquely European predilection. The very thing said to denote a high degree of social evolution, industrialization, urbanization, cultural variety, produced chemical, social, and aesthetic contaminants too, which only civilized bodies were exposed. 28 Non-European bodies and cultures, of course, served as already abhuman markers against which the extent of European degeneration could be measured, but these, ironically, remain stable points of reference. The European body by contrast was a body in flux, the body upon which the forces of entropy worked most visibly. While the Pindasic Gothic may represent the non-white body as an abomination, indefinite in species identity and otherwise abhuman too, as frequently it is concerned with the liminality and fluctuability of the white body. Texts like Conan Doyle's The Third Generation, Walter de la Mare's A, B, O, and Barry Payne's The Undying Thing bring the prospect of white abhumanness directly home with their scenarios of degeneration in Great Britain, as often as not instantiated by the sorts of sexual excesses or perversions writers like Crafty Ebing warned against. 30 Each story explores the causal relationship between sexual indiscretion, syphilis, and constitutional and hereditary taint. The Third Generation, B. 1016, the sins of the fathers become embodied in the deformities of the children, to the extent of producing abhuman monsters in A, B, O, and The Undying Thing. M.P. Shields Guggen's wife describes the loathsome exploits of the Sphinx woman Andromeda, who is descended from a very antique Athenian family, which by constant effort had preserved its purity of blood. 31 Andromeda is a sorceress dedicated to bringing back the ancient worship, and whose magic yields hideous results. Thus Western civilization is revealed as having long since been poisoned at its very font, classical Greece. The title of the same authors, The Pale Ape, emphasizes the liability of the white body to reversion, in this case caused by hereditary insanity in combination with unmanageable male heterosexual desire. 32 In such texts, whiteness is no guarantor of a fully human identity. Indeed, whiteness is identified specifically as the color of abjection. The European body, far from being protected by its putative racial superiority, is a body both grossly corporeal and changeful, capable at any moment of becoming the white thing that wells. Protagonist confronts in The Time Machine, p76. The Time Machine. And during those few revolutions of the Earth's fall, all the activity, all the traditions, the complex organizations, the nations, languages, literatures, aspirations, even the mere memory of man as I knew him, had been swept out of existence. Instead were these frail creatures who had forgotten their hot ancestry, and the white things of which I went in terror. The Time Machine, p76. The Time Machine sets out a narrative of increasing human indifferentiation in three registers: degeneration, devolution, and entropy. The novel jumps ahead 800,000 years to imagine what a particularly remorseless process of downward modification of the human species might yield. The protagonist, known only as the Time Traveler, invents a machine that carries him far into the future, where he finds humanity transmuted into two distinct species. The Eloi are lovely but degenerate beings of atrophied mental powers, who perform no useful labor and live only for pleasure. The Morlocks are species abominations, half human and half ape, living deep underground in industrial communities and maintaining the Eloi as their food source. The novel, by projecting itself into futurity, emphasizes the fluctuability of species, prone to variation and divergence. The human form we know now, and thus conceive as a proper form, is only a temporary one. The novel, however, manifests a certain obstinate inflexibility of imagination. The human body is mutable, but there is only one narrative direction backwards, marked out for its changes. The Time Machine is a text enthralled to the compelling vision of human entropy, much like degeneration theory. On one level, the Time Machine is legible as a cautionary parable about the dehumanizations effected by capitalism. 33 Humanity's divergence into two species, according to the Time Traveler's conjectures, is the logical conclusion of class differentiation in the industrial system of today, p61. Practical labor and those who performed it were increasingly forced underground, a process already underway in the contemporaneity, with its basement sweatshops and restaurants and subterranean railways, of the Time Traveler. Even now, he asks in a passage reminiscent of Cantline, does not an East End worker live in such artificial conditions as practically to be cut off from the natural surface of the earth? p60. The capitalist classes, meanwhile, enclosed the upper earth to make it off limits to the workers, and were free to pursue art and science, and with the eventual perfection of these, leisure. In accordance with biological law, each class adapted to its existing environment, the Morlocks, to become a species of underground tunnelists and workers, the Eloi, a species of drones dependent on their former slaves. Thus the Morlocks can be said to constitute the oppressed classes that have risen up to consume their oppressors, and their cannibalism to have its roots in an industrial capitalism within which system human beings do, most savagely, prey upon and exploit one another. I will leave this reading slightly to one side in order to consider the Time Machine as a specifically Gothic work, as much concerned with abhumanity as inhumanity. Manliness. When the Time Traveler arrives in the year 800 and 2701, he expects to find a civilization which has so progressed in art, science, and philosophy as to be incomprehensible to his 19th century mind, and fears that the human species will have evolved so far morally and physically that he will appear as a man of the Stone Age would in Victorian London, some old world savage animal, a foul creature to be incontinently slain, p25. What he finds instead, at least initially, is a species not improved, but strikingly diminished in both intellectual and physical stature. The Eloi are a graceful, gentle people, characterized by a Dresden China type of prettiness, p28, and speaking a very sweet and liquid tongue, p27. They greet him with laughter and garlands of flowers and, most surprisingly to him, without intellectual curiosity. Like so-called primitives, they assume that he has traveled from the sun and fallen out of the thunderstorm, and like 5-year-old children, they interrogate him for only a few minutes before wandering off to find some other plaything, p29. ALL had the same form of costume, the same soft hairless visage, and the same girlish rotundity of limb, P35. The loveliness of the male Aloy is reminiscent of that of ideal Victorian femininity. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive that hectic beauty of which we used to hear so much, P27. Physically, this variation on the human species has lost all secondary sexual characteristics, so that males cannot be differentiated from females. Cultural change has accommodated physical change, or vice versa, so that masculinity and femininity, signaled by costume and behavior, are indistinguishable. One might call this androgyny, but the narrator is dismayed, and codes it as effeminacy. The species, he laments, has lost its manhood as well as its complexity. The Aloy are indolent, easily fatigued, and almost mindless in their idle pursuit of pleasure, P33. They spend all their time in playing gently, in making love in a half-playful fashion, in eating fruit and sleeping, P51. They have no notion of written language, and their spoken language, composed almost entirely of noun substantives and simple verbs, has no power to express thought, P48. They passively live off the decaying plenty of a once powerful and technologically proficient civilization, in the ruinous splendor of crumbling palaces and unkempt gardens, P34. The Aloy are in many ways an embodiment of the worst fears of the degenerationists. 34 As with degeneration theory, mental decay here finds embodiment in the physical alteration of the human species, the weakened, diminished frame, and loss of the secondary sexual characteristics which, Craft Heaping argued, distinguish the adult human from children and the human species from lower species of animal life. One strand of evolutionist thinking identified savages, women, and children as three types of inferior humanity, evincing in common certain moral and mental inadequacies that signal their incomplete state of evolution, and the Aloy have simultaneously fallen, or devolved, into primitiveness, effeminacy, and childishness. The Aloy display all those characteristics said to typify savages, women, and children: egoism, simplicity, a love of self-adornment, indolence, short attention span, lack of intellectual curiosity, imitativeness, and inability to think abstractly or creatively. The Aloy do not suffer from brain lesions or any of the mental and nervous illnesses Morel and his followers describe. However, the Aloy, like Nordau's modern civilized European, have been betrayed by progress itself. At some point in the future, the time traveler reasons, technological and moral progress secured humanity against hunger, disease, and war, but this security made the qualities of energy, intelligence, and strength, of manliness, in short, obsolete. We are kept keen on the grindstone of pain and necessity, in a struggle of the survival of the fittest, and utopia, for the active Carly type, is a too perfect triumph of man, P40. What, unless biological science is a mass of errors, is the cause of human intelligence and vigor, the time traveler asks. Hardship and freedom, conditions under which the active, strong, and subtle survive and the weaker go to the wall, P39. The ancestors of the Aloy adapted to their new environment, A man-made environment constructed to eliminate all obstacles and challenges, by becoming less vigorous, less intellectual, more idle, vapid, and effete. The too perfect security of the upper worlders had led them to a slow movement of degeneration, to a general dwindling in size, strength, and intelligence, P62. The fittest who survived were not the strongest and boldest, but those weaker-minded, indolent individuals who would not fret under the new monotonous conditions of ease and luxury. The time traveler concludes in a sentence worthy of Nordau that this has ever been the fate of energy insecurity, it takes to art and to eroticism, and then come languor and decay, P40. Social evolution, for the degenerationist, seems to carry within itself the germ of its own decay. Progress towards an ever more refined, ever more productive state of civilization eventually collapses and folds back upon itself. For Nordau, technological advancement leads to widespread immorality and constitutional exhaustion, and within the time machine, projecting itself even further into the future of humanity, it leads to complacency and indolence. For both, the result is the same, a degenerate, decadent race that has lost its manly vigor and drive. Wells, however, envisions a still greater disaster of devolution, whereby one branch of the human species has degenerated even further, back to the remote, animal origins of the human race. His portrayal of the Morlocks is a revision of the theory of urban degeneration. The industrial classes have indeed, as Father Gill warned, developed into a new and terrible species, stunted, deformed, and morally depraved. But rather than dying out in the unwholesome urban environment, as the urban degenerationists predicted would happen, the working class race in Wells' text has adapted to it with a vengeance. The bleached out Morlocks are stooped and light-blind, as befits a species of underground tunnelers, and quick and agile from generations of incessant labor. In the time machine, the idea of the lower classes has become paralyzed into a subspecies of apish lower worlders, scurrying and chattering in their subterranean industrial inferno. The time traveler tries to convince himself that the enslavement of the Aloy in the year 800 and 2701 is only a just revenge for their generations of domination as a callous aristocracy, but he cannot do it. However great their intellectual degradation, the Aloy had kept too much of the human form not to claim my sympathy, P78. Although he feels contempt for the Aloy, they are not abhuman. Perhaps because they are effeminized, they cannot arouse objection, for the time traveler's own distinctly human, here-coded masculine, qualities, strength, forcefulness, courage, energy, appear to advantage beside them. But as to the Morlocks, it was impossible, somehow, to feel any humanity in the things. Like those species in Leviticus that defy classification, the Morlocks are abominations, P95, and they arouse in the time traveler a sense of quivering horror he cannot quite justify or explain, P94. White things. The Morlocks are not actually introduced till the second half of the novel. They first appear as dream creatures, phantasmic apparitions which, the time traveler speculates, may be the products of an overheated imagination. For example, he awakens one night to catch a half-glimpse of the grayish animal that pawed at his face while he dreamed most disagreeably that he was drowned, and that sea anemones were feeling over his face with their soft palps, P54, and later, in the ghastly half-light of early dawn, he sees, in the distance, white figures that he half-jokingly decides to be ghosts. Twice I fancied I saw a solitary white, ape-like creature running quickly up the hill, and once near the ruins I saw a leash of them carrying some dark body, P55. But finally he meets one of his ghosts face to face, and in a highly specular encounter, while their eyes meet and the time traveler becomes convulsed with symptoms, the Morlock changes from a ghost to a thing, from a specter to an abomination. In the dim half-light again. Within the profound obscurity of the ruins of some massive structure, the time traveler discovers a pair of luminous eyes watching him from out of the darkness, and the old instinctive dread of wild beasts comes over him. Gradually he makes out a queer little ape-like figure, dull white, with strange large grayish red eyes. and flaxen hair on its head and down its back, and this thing, as he calls it, retreats down a deep shaft, regarding him steadily all the way, pages 56 to 7. I do not know how long I sat peering down that well. It was not for some time. Then I could succeed in persuading myself that the thing I had seen was human. But, gradually, the truth dawned on me, that my graceful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generation, but that this bleached, obscene, nocturnal thing, which had flashed before me, was also heir to all the ages. Pages 57 to 8, even though the narrator is able to describe the Morlocks in detail, both here and later in the novel after he explores their underground community and then fights an epic battle with them in the forest, the reader's perception of these ape humans remains shadowy and indefinite, since the time traveler is anxious to convey not so much the Morlocks' physical appearance as his horrified reaction to their presence. His response is instinctive and visceral, and to describe it he must resort continually to a Gothic language of indefinition. I had a feeling of intense fear for which I could perceive no definite reason. P63. I felt a peculiar shrinking from those pallid bodies. They were just the half-bleached color of the worms and things one sees preserved in spirit in a zoological museum. And they were filthily cold to the touch. P63. The Morlocks, he says, have a sickening quality, as something inhuman and malign. Instinctively I loathed them. P71. The overwhelming disgustingness of the Morlocks may be partially attributed to their cannibalism. Cannibalism is the great secret of the novella, and the narrative works up to it very slowly, with a series of unanswered questions. What was the dark body the time traveler saw the Morlocks carrying up the hill? Why are there no aged or infirm among the Eloi? Why do the Eloi fear the dark, and sleep together in huddled bands? Why does the Morlocks' underground habitat reek of freshly shed blood, and just what is that red joint of raw meat the time traveler glimpses in their underworld? P67, here in a future where all domestic animals have become extinct. The reader may have little trouble answering these questions, but the text nonetheless shrouds them in an aura of mystery and horror. Here cannibalism is the great unspeakable, a trauma instantiating hysterical symptoms, including an excess of textual affect, just as have human sexuality does in the great God Pan. The time traveler, like the several Mackin narrators, cannot bear to put a name to the unspeakable thing he has discovered, as he rather belatedly deduces the source of the Morlocks' food supply. He breaks off mid-sentence. I thought once more of the meat that I had seen. I felt assured of what it was. Human prejudice against human flesh is no deep-seated instinct. And so these inhuman sons of man. P77. Within the time machine, cannibalism is the ultimate and most disgusting proof of abhumanness. The human reveals his bestiality by preying on his fellow, and the cannibalized victim is animalized as well. The Eloi are described as cattle. Both eater and eaten are things, one manifesting the indiscriminate appetite of the material world, the other losing all specificity whatsoever as it becomes absorbed into the digestive tract and tissue of its predator. However, while the time traveler is willing to undergo a 10-day fruit diet among the Eloi, when he returns to his own present the first thing he does is wolf down a meal of red meat. Save me some of that mutton, he demands of his dinner guests. I'm starving for a bit of meat. P16. Although he casts his allegiance with the Morlocks' victims, and renounces all kinship with the cannibalistic descendants of the human race, the novel always emphasizes his greater similarity to the abhuman ape-man. The Eloi may be more recognizably human, but the narrator bears far less resemblance to these mild, effeminate creatures than to the Morlocks. For in contrast to their apish appearance, the Morlocks are exemplary Victorians. They are intelligent, shrewd, and industrious. They operate complex machinery. They are actively employed in the production of useful goods. They are energetically masculine, like the time traveler himself. The time traveler alternates between the pronouns it and he in describing the Morlocks. And finally, they are whiter. The raciality of the Eloi is not particularly foreground, but the Morlocks most emphatically is. The time machine stresses the liability of the white man, the Victorian man, to abhumanness. For if the Morlocks are savage beasts, they are still not much worse than the time traveler, whose story is always bringing his own savagery to the forefront. He fantasizes about and occasionally indulges in brutality towards the annoyingly passive Eloi, and gives into the passion of bloodlust when he fights the Morlocks, exulting that I could feel the succulent giving of flesh and bone under my blows. P92. Visiting the Morlock underworld, he remarks, I stood there with only the weapons and the powers that nature had endowed me with, hands, feet, and teeth. P68. The reader is always reminded of the narrator's own origins in struggling beasthood. For it is not the old instinctive dread of wild beasts, nor primitive fears of creatures who hunt in the dark, nor even the knowledge of the Morlock's cannibalism that can account for the disproportionate terror and disgust they arouse in the time traveler. This emotion is perhaps instead an awareness of its own abjectness, while at the same time his overcharged hatred of the Morlocks. I long very much to kill a Morlock or two. P83 is an assertion of his own separateness from the thingness they represent. Entropy. But thingness nonetheless overwhelms the time machine. The novel does not conclude with the Eloi and the Morlocks, with the twin vision of human degeneration and devolution, though this were terrible enough. The time traveler takes his machine many millennia into the future, where he finds a cold, desolate planet. The Earth, like the moon, has ceased to rotate, and the sun is dying out. I cannot convey the sense of abominable desolation that hung over the world. The red eastern sky, the northward blackness, the salt Dead Sea, the uniform poisonous-looking green of the lichenous plants, all contributed to an appalling effect. P104. The human race in this apocalyptic future has long been extinct. All that remains of the world, besides very primitive plant life, is its hunger. The time traveler, having just fled from the cannibalistic Morlocks, narrowly escapes being eaten by a monstrous crab-like creature. Its evil eyes were wriggling on their stalks, its mouth was all alive with appetite, and its vast ungainly claws, smeared with algal slime, were descending upon me. P103. The crab's voracious mouth, I could see the many palps of its complicated mouth flickering and feeling as it moved. P103 is the last vestige of morphic complexity he finds in the near-dead world. Even this disappears. He flees further on into time, where the earth has become still chillier and more desolate, and where the last surviving animal creature has no recognizable form whatsoever. It was a round thing, the size of a football perhaps, or, it may be, bigger. And tentacles trailed down from it. It seemed black against the weltering blood-red water, and it was hopping fitfully about. P106. Overcome with a deadly nausea. P106. The time traveler returns to the present. The future, he has discovered, holds nothing but indifferentiation and its concomitant, disgust.